Hi, and welcome to the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. I'm really happy to have author Mike Sielski join me again. Mike was nice enough to talk to me before when he wrote his book about Kobe Bryant. He has a new book, Magic in the Air, The Myth, the Mystery, and Soul of the Slam Dunk. And what I love about your books is that you talk about the sports aspect, but also social aspects and other things that are happening at the time. And I want to first start with you, just ask a basic question. I'm sure you get asked a lot. Why the fascination with the dunk? Why did you decide to choose this topic?
All right. First of all, Brian, it's awesome to be with you. Thank you for having me on your show. So after the Kobe book came out in 2022, I was hunting around for another book topic and pitching ideas to my agent. And around that time, a friend of mine, Tyler Kepner, who's a Flowertown native, Germantown Academy alum, and has covered Major League Baseball for a long, long time for both the New York Times and The Athletic, came out with a great book called K, A History of Baseball in 10 Pitches. And what Tyler did in that book was he basically wrote a history of the sport of baseball through the prism of each of the pitches that a pitcher throws. So chapter one was all about the fastball. And he basically went from like Walter Johnson to all the guys who throw 100 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour today. And then chapter two was the curveball, and chapter three was the slider, and so on. And I thought that was a genius way to be able to write a book, kind of a different angle on a really big topic. And the book was full of all these cool anecdotes and history of baseball and all kinds of stuff. So I started thinking about whether I could do something similar for basketball. And the more I thought about basketball, the more it occurred to me that all the big figures and most of the big moments in the sport uh, were above the rim. You know, you're talking about guys like Michael Jordan and Julius Erving and Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and David Thompson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar / Lou Alcindor at UCLA. And I thought, boy, if I could write the history of basketball through the prism of the slam dunk, that might take me into some interesting places. And what really solidified it for me was digging into a little bit the fact that from 1967 to 1976, the dunk was banned in high school and college basketball in the United States. And I don't know if you feel this way. There are certain facts or aspects of history that we kind of gloss over. Like they get explained in like a sentence or two, and they deserve a much deeper treatment. And that was something that occurred to me when I was thinking about the ban on the dunk. Like, well, wait a minute, who decided that it ought to be banned and why? I mean, I had some ideas and thoughts and theories about what was actually going on there, but I had never read a really detailed explanation for why the dunk had been banned. And that question really piqued my curiosity. And so I thought the dunk would take me into the civil rights movement and the rise of Black culture and the changes in the sport over the years and racial dynamics and sociological dynamics and all kinds of stuff. And it ended up doing exactly that.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that as a little boy, I'd go to the Sixers games, and it was when the Sixers still had Wilt Chamberlain. And I do remember them saying dip or dunk, or the little comment Dave Zinkoff would be saying those things. But I also remember watching, I think it was at the time, Lou Alcindor, Bill Walton, all these people like shooting bank shots as opposed to dunking. And David Thompson, you know, so what was the cause as you found it, and how did you link that into the civil rights and our social situation over the years?
So my thesis or through line for the book is that the dunk really was an engine of change, both in basketball and to a lesser degree in American society, kind of a symbol of what the country was going through at certain points in its history, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement, the rise of Black athletes, things of that nature. So as I said, the dunk gets banned in 1967, and the reasons given at the time publicly were, oh, you know, it's safety reasons. We don't want players getting hurt. Rims are getting destroyed. Backboards are getting shattered. It's costing money, et cetera, et cetera. But what was really going on was that in 1966, Texas Western beats Kentucky in the national championship game. And Texas Western becomes the first team with 5 Black starters to win a national title game. And they beat Kentucky, who's coached by Adolph Rupp, who has to that point hasn't even recruited a Black player yet. All the players on the Wildcats are white, Pat Riley among them. And early in that game, David Lattin, the biggest, strongest player on Texas Western, is told by Coach Don Haskins, the first opportunity you have, I want you to dunk the ball in the face of whatever Kentucky player is guarding you, so that we can intimidate them. And Lattin does exactly that. It's the first basket of the game for Texas Western, and they never give up the lead. They go on and win. And Rupp hated this and was working behind the scenes to make sure that the dunk got banned. And that campaign was intensified after Lou Alcindor played his first year of varsity basketball at UCLA. He was so dominant, and nobody could stop him. And so it became this thing, dunking, that the quote unquote National Basketball Committee, and we did have such a thing in this country at the time, the body that oversaw amateur basketball in the United States, decided, we can't have dunking anymore. This is not basketball. The sport is becoming something that it was never supposed to be. And what it really was a bunch of white men who had their hands on the levers of power on the sport and chose to throw those levers. And, it was really kind of an insidious decision, a stupid decision. And you look back on it and you say, my God, what if we could have seen David Thompson playing at North Carolina State and being able to dunk the ball while he was there, and Julius Erving at UMass not able to dunk the ball? Really a missed opportunity for college basketball, which continued to grow in spite of the fact that the ban was in place.
I'm speaking with Mike Sielski, author of Magic in the Air, The Myth, the Mystery, and the Soul of the Slam Dunk. Tell me a little bit also about your book on Kobe Bryant. Got a lot of national attention. I know CNN did a documentary on Kobe, and you were featured quite a bit. It must be rewarding when you write a book, and not only do a lot of people read it, but it gets another life.
Yeah, one of my goals, Brian, honestly, when I write my books, is I want them to be evergreen. I don't want them to have an expiration date. You see that a lot nowadays, both in sports books and I think particularly in political books. They sell great in the first week or two, and then we elect a new president or something changes in the dynamics of the country, and those books kind of fade away because they're really not relevant anymore. And in every book I write, my goal, at least in part, is to have somebody be able to buy or pick up that book 5 years after its publication date, 10 years after its publication date, and find it as relevant as it has ever been. That was my goal with the Kobe book, which was really his origin story. There isn't very much in the rise about Kobe with the Los Angeles Lakers. It's almost entirely about his early life, growing up in Italy with his mother and father, as his dad Joe was playing professional basketball over there, his life at Lower Merion High School, all the steps he took and the things that led to him entering the NBA and becoming a global superstar. And I wanted the same principle to apply here with Magic in the Air. I want somebody to pick this book up 5 years from now and be able to say, oh, okay, I have a pretty good sense of how basketball developed and the role the dunk played in it, and maybe learn some things about the history of the sport and even the history of America that they didn't know before.
I'm speaking with Mike Sielski, author of Magic in the Air, The Myth, the Mystery, and the Soul of the Slam Dunk. Mike's a fellow LaSalle grad, so I'm always happy to talk about LaSalle and talk about those great years there and the basketball tradition of LaSalle. Back in 1954, they won the national championship. Those early players, were there many of them who were dunking and kind of proceeding? I know they talk about Elgin Baylor a lot.
Yeah, it was one of those. I felt like in researching the book, Brian, that I was stepping on the edge of a rabbit hole, because when you do a book like this, you want to kind of answer some questions, and one of the questions that naturally comes up is, who was the first player to dunk in a game? And I got about as close to answering that question as I could without driving myself crazy. I realized there was no way I was ever going to pinpoint who the first player to dunk was, because people weren't necessarily using the term dunk in basketball in the sport's early years. So there are definitely some early anecdotes about players who probably dunked, and there were early iterations of basketball played at outdoor courts around cages, and there's an anecdote about a player climbing the cage, like climbing a fence and catching a pass and dropping the ball through the hoop. Elgin Baylor was definitely someone who helped to popularize the dunk. There's a chapter in the book about a guy named Joe Fortenberry, who grew up in Happy, Texas, very small town in West Texas. and ended up being on the 1936 U.S. Olympic team. He was part of the first U.S. men's basketball Olympic team ever, and part of the first Olympic team to win a gold medal in men's basketball. And that that was in Berlin. That's the Olympics of Jesse Owens, of the boys in the boat, of everyone kind of thumbing their nose in Hitler's eye. And Joe Fortenberry was on that team. And a couple of months before the Olympics, in an exhibition game at Madison Square Garden, he and a teammate are going through their pregame warmups, and a New York Times writer notices them, quote, dropping the ball through the hoop as if they are dunking a roll into coffee. And the writer, Arthur Daly, puts that in his column in the New York Times. And that's really the first tangible sign of the words basketball and dunk being linked together. And that really kind of popularizes the idea of players dunking the ball. It doesn't mean that Joe Fortenberry was the first person to do it. It just means he's really the first person to kind of be credited with inspiring the connection between basketball and the dunk.
I noticed that you chose Julius Erving, Dr. J, for the cover. And obviously he is synonymous for an entire generation with the dunk. Is he still, in your eyes, the most spectacular person to dunk, or have a lot of people kind of risen past him and developed their own flair?
He is for me, Brian. I think his January 1983 Rock the Cradle dunk against the Lakers, which I'm sure you've seen and millions of people have seen, where he goes over Michael Cooper on a fast break. I think it's the greatest dunk in basketball history. It's spontaneous. It's in a vitally important game, a big game during a regular season. It foreshadowed what was going to happen 4 months down the road, where the Sixers, who had been trying to win a championship and coming close year after year after year for the better part of a decade, finally beat the Lakers in the finals and got that elusive championship. And for me, as a Philadelphia native, as someone who really, appreciates and follows and treasures the history of sports, I wanted to kind of restore Julius in this book to what I think is his proper place among the all-time greats in basketball. You watch ESPN or Fox Sports and you hear all this discussion and debate about, well, who's the greatest player of all time? And you hear Michael Jordan and LeBron James, and maybe somebody throws Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell a nod out of respect, but Julius very rarely gets mentioned. And I think Julius really is a transcendent and transformative player in pro basketball history, because he married the street game from the playgrounds and the cities of America with mainstream popularity. He takes the game to a different place in the late 70s and early 80s by playing above the rim, and by doing so in a way where he's acknowledged to be a great teammate. He's acknowledged to be someone who carries himself with a lot of grace and class and intelligence. He made it okay for white America to understand and think that a player who was individually gifted could still be a great teammate and a winning player. And I think that needed to be acknowledged on a big scale. So that was one of my goals in writing the book.
So in other words, you were seeing an evolution there at that point where socially it was more accepted, and also maybe there was hopefully a greater connection between African Americans, white Americans, and others.
Yeah, exactly. You go from the ban in college and high school basketball ending in 1976 to then Julius's emergence with the Sixers that same year. And the shame of it, of course, is that if you only knew Dr. J from his time with the Sixers, you missed, the several years he had spent in the ABA with the Virginia Squires and the New York Nets, where he was really in his prime. And but you need that figure. You need a figure to show the vast majority of casual basketball fans, most of whom, let's be honest, were white at that time, kind of mainstream America, to say to them, hey, this is nothing to fear. This is enhancing and improving the experience of watching basketball. Don't ban the dunk, embrace the dunk. Look at what someone like Julius or David Thompson can do. And he, in particular, Julius, paves the way for Michael Jordan then to take the sport to a level it had never been before and probably hasn't been at since.
In speaking to people, when you obviously interviewed them for the book, who was the person who surprised you the most with what you learned from them, through all the interviews?
I think Julius would be near the top of that list. I got him to curse, which is maybe my proudest achievement of this book. I got him on the phone for about a half hour, 45 minutes. And I said, Doc, there's this narrative out there that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson came along in 1979 and really saved the NBA, that the NBA had been in, tough straits before then. And they came along and saved everything. And he said, yeah, I think that's bullshit. Because Julius had been in the league for 4 or 5 years, and he had been the star. He and Kareem had really been the pillars of the league at that time, and certainly Julius was part of the influx of players from the ABA who brought more talent and more diversification of the sport and the way it was played to the NBA and kind of revitalized it. But there was that. There's a great anecdote in the book about Julius as a teenager dunking in a pickup game on Long Island over Bob Beamon, who 2 months later, after Julius jammed on him, would set the world long jump record at the 1968 Summer Olympics, a record that would stand for 23 years. So that gives you a sense of how amazing an athlete Julius Erving actually was, that he dunked over the world long jump champion in Bob Beamon. So Julius's interview was pretty surprising. I didn't know anything about Joe Fortenberry before I started researching this book. That was a lot of fun. There's a chapter on Darnell Hillman, who was the first player to win the NBA slam dunk contest. And it's a really fun chapter about what the contest was like. Got to interview Ron Shelton, who wrote and directed White Men Can't Jump, in addition to Bull Durham. So there was a lot of fun experiences in reporting and writing the book.
What did you learn socially? Obviously, you're always aware, and those of us who read your columns in the Philadelphia area were aware of. But what did you learn in exploring this that kind of maybe either reshaped or helped shape your thoughts on things?
I think I don't think I had an appreciation for how stacked the deck was against Black athletes throughout the 1960s and 70s. I mean, I understood it intellectually. I'd written a book earlier in my life about Jackie Robinson, so I certainly hadn't had what I thought was an appreciation for what those athletes went throughout the 20th century. But it wasn't until I did the research for that chapter about the dunk ban that I understood kind of how the system was really stacked against those athletes and what it took for them to kind of bubble up to the surface of basketball and really make their mark. Whether you're talking about schoolyard legends like Earl the Goat Manigault or Jumpin' Jackie Jackson, and then players, as you mentioned, like Elgin Baylor or Julius Erving or David Thompson, what it took for them to get to the very top of the sport. That really, I came away from the experience, much more, I think, understanding and appreciative of the journey that those athletes took to get to where they were.
Anybody disappoint you in the interviews? Like anybody, I don't mean that didn't give you time or whatever, but what they had to say kind of shocked you or disappointed you?
Not really. I mean, there were a couple of people who didn't speak to me. I really wanted to talk to David Thompson and to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and through different intermediaries, they declined to speak with me. I would have loved to have talked to both of those guys, especially David Thompson. I don't think he gets the due he deserves as a transcendent figure in the game. But otherwise, people were generally pretty helpful because so much of the book was about unearthing stories of athletes who, to one degree or another, had been kind of forgotten. It's one of my pet peeves in today's day and age, Brian. So many people act like history began in the year 2000. I was just on Twitter, X, yesterday, as a matter of fact, and somebody posted something about the Denver Nuggets, Los Angeles Clippers playoff game that ended on a dunk at the buzzer that the Nuggets won. And somebody posted, is this the greatest, most clutch dunk in basketball history? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, everybody knows that North Carolina State won the 1983 national championship because of Lorenzo Charles's dunk. And it was like, this didn't happen that long ago. And it's been around for a while that people have been familiar with this moment in college basketball history. And we just kind of forget it whenever the next, hot happening thing comes along. So I experienced my experience in doing the book was that so many people were willing to speak to me and eager to speak to me because they didn't want their stories to be forgotten.
Anything I didn't ask you that you want to talk about before we go? Because I'm really appreciative of all your time.
No, I would say the one thing that was that you mentioned what you asked what disappointed me. And I almost forgot to mention this. In the chapter on the dunk ban, I reached out to the NCAA to try to get access to their archives because I wanted to see if there was any correspondence amongst people at the NCAA at the time the dunk was banned. I wanted to see if there was kind of a smoking gun about, hey, this is exactly why we're doing it. And the NCAA wouldn't allow me access to their records at all. And so I ended up printing in the book the email back and forth between me and a representative from the NCAA. And I said flat out to them, look, if you don't want to allow me access to your records, that's fine. But I'm going to tell everyone in the book that you didn't allow me this access and why you didn't allow me this access. So just be prepared for that. I'm going to allow people to draw their own conclusions. And I never heard back from the NCAA. So that entire exchange is printed in the chapter on the dunk ban. And I don't think it reflects particularly well on the NCAA. I think there's a lot going on in college sports right now that doesn't reflect well on the NCAA. And here's another pebble on the pile. Yeah, sports is one of the last remaining things that really ties all of us together. Right. I mean, we're so fragmented in every aspect of our lives now, and especially in the media and information that we consume, that whether you're talking about football or basketball or baseball or anything, sports is one of the last institutions in our society that kind of cuts across all those ways that we separate ourselves. And I think it's really valuable in that regard.
Mike Sielski, thanks for joining me on the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. It was a pleasure having you with me. It was a lot of fun, and I do appreciate the time, and continued success with this book and your writing going forward.
Thanks so much, Brian. I enjoyed it.